Something I've been asked about by a few people in the comments section is how and why the London Underground came to be the London Underground. As I think I've said before, well, I know I've said before many times, the Underground wasn't planned as a cohesive network, but rather it was the result of a whole bunch of different companies building their own lines through London. There was no universal standard, they weren't necessarily intended to complement each other. In some cases, the lines were competing with each other. As you might imagine, it's a pretty big subject, which is going to take more than one video to look at completely, so I suppose we'd better get started, hadn't we? Now, as a quick disclaimer, each line has a complicated history in itself, so I am going to simplify a bit so I don't drown you in information. I might go back in future videos and look in more detail at the history of each line. Even so, I've had to divide this into 3 parts because this is a very big subject. The first line to be built was the Metropolitan Railway, opening in 1863. This was the first underground railway in the world. In fact, it didn't really consider itself an underground railway, but as a main line that happened to have an underground section. Over the decades, this would expand outwards into the suburbs and eventually 50 miles out into the Buckinghamshire countryside. This will become relevant later. I think in part 2. The second to open was the Hammersmith and City Railway, which came along in 1864. This company was a joint venture between the Metropolitan Railway and the Great Western Railway. They actually took over the line between them in 1867. The third was the Metropolitan District Railway. This opened in 1868. It was generally thought that it would be a good idea to build a big circular line in central London to connect several of the big terminus stations. The Metropolitan Railway already had the top bit covered, but the Metropolitan District Railway was set up to build the bottom bit. If you're wondering why it was confusingly called the Metropolitan District Railway, that was because the original idea was that they'd build the circle, then the whole thing would be absorbed by the Metropolitan Railway. That didn't happen, and instead the two companies wound up in this massive rivalry. Anyway, people started referring to the line as simply the District Railway, and the new name wound up becoming official. In 1868, the East London Railway was opened. This was jointly operated by several different companies, including the Metropolitan and the District Railway. It used the tunnel under the Thames constructed by Mark Brunel to provide a rail link with South London. In 1884, the Circle Line was finally completed. Now, I should note that this wasn't a separate line per se, but rather a route jointly operated by the Metropolitan and District Railways. It was generally known by the name of the Inner Circle. In 1890, the City and South London Railway opened. This was the first electric-powered underground railway and the first deep-level tube. It made up part of what is now the Northern Line. In 1898, we got the Waterloo and City Railway. This was unusual, as underground railways went, in that it was built as a feeder for a main line company. The London and South Western Railway owned the main line into Waterloo, and they built the Waterloo and City Railway so they could serve the city without building an expensive above-ground railway. Again, this will become relevant later. 1900 saw the opening of the Central London Railway, which would become the Central Line. In 1904, the Great Northern and City Railway was built. This ran from Finsbury Park to Moorgate and was unusual in that it was a deep-level tube built to take main line trains. The idea was that the Great Northern Railway, who owned the main line into King's Cross, could use it to access the city. But the Great Northern Railway changed their mind, so it wound up being just another underground line. It's around this time that things really start to come together, because in 1900 Charles Tyson Yerkes enters the scene. Yerkes was an American businessman who'd made a lot of money on public transport in Chicago before being chased out of town, and now wanted to do the same in London, presumably without being chased out of town. His business philosophy was, in his words, buy up old junk, fix it up a little, and unload it on other fellows. His first acquisition in London was a proposed line called the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway, which opened in 1907. It would become known as the Hampstead Tube and later would become part of the Northern Line. In 1901, Yerkes set up a company to electrify the District Railway, called the Metropolitan District Electric Traction Company, and by September he would control the District Railway. That was a busy month for him. He would also acquire a proposed line called the Great Northern and Strand Railway and another called the Brompton and Piccadilly Circus Railway, the latter of which was already owned by the District Railway. These two railways, which duplicated each other's route to a certain extent, were combined into a single line, the Great Northern, Piccadilly and Brompton Railway, which would open in 1906 and later be known as the Piccadilly Line. But Yerkes wasn't done yet. In 1902 he acquired the planned Baker Street and Waterloo Railway, which of course is now the Bakerloo Line, and would also open in 1907. In April 1902 he formed a new company, Underground Electric Railways of London, to manage it all. This meant that a single company owned the Piccadilly, Bakerloo and District lines as well as part of the Northern Line. Furthermore, because the Inner Circle was partly owned by the District Railway, Yerkes was able to strong-arm the Metropolitan into accepting his standards for electrification. And then, in 1905, he died. The whole thing nearly fell apart because, frankly, Yerkes was dodgy as all heck, but the new management were eventually able, just about, to bring things under control. That's a complicated story, but the part that's relevant to this video is the appointment of General Manager Albert Stanley and Commercial Manager Frank Pick. They wanted to unify the different railways as much as possible, and Frank Pick was particularly interested in the concept of a single corporate identity. For the first time, the different lines became formally known as the London Underground. But it wasn't just about corporate identity. They adopted a common ticketing system. Wherever possible, they made their lines mutually compatible. They modernised and extended their lines where necessary. In 1912 they got into the Bus Racket, buying out the London General Omnibus Company, and the bus builder, Associated Equipment Company, better known as AEC. In 1913 they bought three major tram operators, London United, South Metropolitan and Metropolitan Electric. Also in 1913 they took over the Central London Railway and the City and South London Railway. This meant that one major company now controlled a vast amount of London's transport network. They became known by the slightly sinister nickname of the Combine. The Metropolitan Railway, meanwhile, had bought the Great Northern and City Railway out in 1913. They also effectively operated passenger services on the East London and Hammersmith and City lines, because those lines were electrified and the Metropolitan had electric trains. Essentially what this meant was that by the First World War you had two major companies operating railways underground, plus the little Waterloo and City Railway. So what you had was something that was almost, but not quite, the London Underground we know and mostly love. What caused that final push was, ironically, nothing to do with trains. You can find out how in part 2. If you're not yet subscribed to this channel, you may wish to do so and hit the bell icon so you know when the second part comes out. And I'll see you again soon for part 2 of this tale from the tube.